Greetings and welcome to Ill Repute, the podcast about women and women first. My name is Sovereign Sire. I am a writer, a comedian, and wearing the same that Blossom wore in the 90s. Just missing the felt hat.
Yeah, you need the bucket hat.
I got the shoes
and
then the long dress. Like the long dress. We remember this vaguely.
Yes.
When that was like the 90s are back. And now I get to wear that stuff as a grown-up instead of as like a weird preteen. So
yeah, I'm collecting lace camisoles. I can't wait.
Right? Like there's certain aspects where I'm like, oh, I got this. I got it.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
And I'm Ella Darling, a VR pioneer, a former librarian, a sex worker, and a sprightly enthusiast of neon lights of naked girls.
Hey, who is
I've got a whole wall full.
It's my favorite.
It's great.
Your house is decorated like if a 15-year-old got to have their own apartment.
Yeah,
And
like
I
a
love that
15-year-old
for
boy
you.
kinda sometimes.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Now, we here at Ill Repute support women's rights, but more importantly,
We support women's wrongs, darling.
that's right, baby.
And which woman's wrongs are we righting today?
Witches. Witches, bitch.
Mm-hmm.
This is part 2 of our 2-parter on the history of the European witch hunts. Last week, we went over the material and social conditions of the time period of the witch hunts. So we got a primer on the birth of capitalism, on the heretic religious movement, and on the social preparation for the brutalization of women that's about to take place. And so now we get to the juicy stuff, which is the Black Death and the witch hunts. Are you ready?
I was born ready for this, yes. So, the Black Death, also known simply as the plague, was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. It is estimated to have killed between 75 million and 200 million people in Europe, Asia, and North Africa during the 14th century. The term Black Death refers specifically to the outbreak of bubonic plague that occurred during this time, although the broader term plague can refer to different forms of the disease.
The Black Death was primarily caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is transmitted through fleas that infested rats. The most common form of the disease was bubonic plague, which caused the sudden onset of fever, chills, weakness, and the painful swelling of lymph nodes called buboes, hence bubonic plague. In addition to bubonic plague, the Black Death could also manifest in more lethal forms, pneumonic plague, which affected the lungs and was highly contagious through respiratory droplets, and septicemic plague, which infected the bloodstream and was often fatal even before symptoms appeared.
The origins of the Black Death are believed to be in Central Asia, from where it spread along trade routes to Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The bacterium was likely carried by fleas on rats. The Black Death reached its peak in Europe between 1347 and 1351, although outbreaks continued for several centuries. The most famous outbreak occurred in the mid-14th century. The plague led to a drastic reduction in population, labor shortages, and social upheaval. Entire villages and towns were depopulated, and some regions saw a collapse of agricultural and economic systems.
People in the 14th century had little understanding of the causes of the plague, and various responses were attempted, including quarantine measures, flagellant movements, and persecution of minority groups such as Jews and lepers. None of these measures were effective in halting the spread of the disease. So now, flagellant movements were groups of people that felt that the plague was punishment by God for heresy, for corruption, etc.
Mhm.
And what they would do is travel in groups, flagellating themselves. That means whipping themselves on the back as a form of penance to try to spiritually get rid of the plague by making up for the failings of the people to follow the word of God.
It's atoning for the sins of others through corporal punishment to yourself.
Yeah. So for those that are not familiar with what flagellation means, that are not in the BDSM community, yeah.
I'm caught red-handed.
Yes. This disruption of the social and economic order created a climate of fear, uncertainty, and hardship. In times of crisis, people often sought explanations and scapegoats for their suffering, which could include the persecution of perceived outsiders and those accused of witchcraft.
The devastation caused by the Black Death prompted religious responses. Some believed that the plague was a divine punishment for sin, and there was an increased focus on religious fervor and orthodoxy. This religious climate laid the groundwork for the demonization of witches and the belief that they were in league with the devil, further contributing to the witch hunts. The aftermath of the Black Death was accompanied by a sense of moral decay and corruption. This perception, along with religious fervor, led to an increased belief in the existence of witches and the idea that they were responsible for spreading evil and malevolence in society.
In the wake of the Black Death, there was a heightened fear of outsiders and those perceived as different. This fear contributed to the identification of marginalized individuals, such as women, the elderly, and the poor, as potential witches. Accusations of witchcraft often targeted those who were already socially vulnerable. The Catholic Church played a significant role in responding to the Black Death and the ensuing turmoil. The Church's desire to assert its authority and maintain control over religious beliefs and practices led to a crackdown on heresy and unorthodox beliefs, including the belief in witchcraft. This contributed to the witch hunts, as the Church was often involved in witch trials and prosecutions. From an anthropological perspective, from the book Witchcraft, Lycanthropy, Drugs, and Disease. Quote, historical and ethnographic studies have shown that the staggering die-offs associated with virgin soil epidemics are frequently accompanied by extreme socio-psychological responses, as faith in established institutions fade away and values disintegrate. Often such epidemics lead to scapegoating, physical violence, and recourse to supernatural explanation. Such reactions express the pervasive human impulse to do something in times of extreme stress and upheaval in the hopes of establishing control over a world gone awry, unquote. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, it sounds atrociously familiar, troublingly familiar.
What in the QAnon? I would say that the belief in QAnon, this belief that there's some plot to take children and destroy the world. So the belief in like this kind of Illuminati of people is very similar. This idea that like Democrats and celebrities that are liberal are actually acting in league with some kind of nefarious power to bring about the destruction of society.
Right. And similarly, they see it on both a societal level and on a personally, morally despicable level, because that's where we see all these rumors about everybody in Hollywood has a secret room in their house where they rape and eat children, or the pizza place where is no I thought it was Cosmic Pizza, like that, where there's no basement there, but apparently there's all these misdeeds going on in the basement that doesn't exist.
Right.
Like, it's not just they're bringing down society. It's also attaching it to the most innocent and most vulnerable in society, which they are preying on, because it's not enough to do one or the other. It's like a holistic or vilification.
Right. And also the vilification of Asian folks that happened, right? That, oh, this was a lab leak. This was this was a that. This idea of like assigning blame to an entire group of people and then inflicting physical violence on them, you know, like, so this book is correct. I mean, this is something that is sort of a universal human response to plagues. And now the term virgin soil refers to when it's a brand new disease. So like COVID would be kind of the same thing. COVID was like a virgin soil sort of event. We didn't have any vaccines for it. We didn't know exactly what its mechanisms were. And those are particularly devastating because there aren't any measures. right? Whereas like an outbreak of the measles would not be a virgin soil event.
Exactly.
But, right.
Okay. To be honest, when I was reading the line that it originated in Asia, I got deja vu chills about the way that people have handled COVID in the worst ways possible. But yeah, I mean, humans are predictable, and our responses to things is too.
Yeah.
In the wake of the first outbreak, it was said the Jews had poisoned the wells with magic potions that had spread the disease. Thousands of Jewish people were rounded up and executed. As time passed, it was decided that it wasn't just Jews spreading the disease through wells, but that these people were part of a larger conspiracy by Satan himself to destroy the earth, which paved the way for the witch hunts. Wow.
A lot of people don't realize it, that before the witch trials were extended to women, essentially, in Europe, that the first phase was Jewish people who were already...
Genocide is always beta tested on Jewish people.
Yeah. So that was that they started by rounding up Jewish folks. And then when that didn't work, then it was like, oh, it didn't work because like they were guilty, but then it extends beyond.
There's always, just like the people who swear up and down that the world is going to end on this date because this preacher said so and he backs it up on, like they always have a way to backtrack. They always have a way to explain things in post when it never worked out. The guilty were tortured until they confessed and then burned at the stake, and those that didn't confess were walled up in the prisons and left to die. By the outbreaks of the plague in the late 1400s, half of Europe's population had been killed by the disease. That's huge. That's a lot.
Yeah. So you could understand why people would believe that there must be some kind of supernatural plot, because if everywhere you look, people are just dropping dead.
Yeah.
And you like germ theory and none of that is around yet. It must have felt like they were being punished for something. From Witchcraft, Lycanthropy, Drugs, and Disease. Quote, Europeans were convinced that the prophecy of the Book of Revelations had come to pass and that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the harbingers of war, famine, death, and disease, were upon them. Many lived in constant anticipation of disaster, and there were frequent reports of people seeing the apparition of the Antichrist, unquote. So we've cleared the hurdles of feudalism, the birth of capitalism, and the Black Death. So now let's drill down into the witch bit.
Witchcraft did not exist as a concept until the witch hunts. Magic and spellcasting existed since the beginning of time, but there were no large-scale attacks on it. Magic was in fact feared by the ruling class. In the 7th and 8th centuries, there were laws made against magic, but only magic that harmed others. If something scares the ruling class, that's not a great position to be. Like, unless you are harnessing that immediately for revolution, that's a dangerous place to live.
So slaves, now we're talking about slaves in the Roman Empire. We're talking about 7th. Slaves tended to believe in magic, and this belief in magic made them powerful and helped fuel uprisings. Primarily, this had to do with prognostication, which is predicting the future, which could embolden slaves to better their situations by their victory being guaranteed. As it was, as capitalism began to take root, belief in magic and prophecy was fueling the serfs to revolt. So it had to be put down, and that was done through both the church and the ruling class acting together to create a legal framework for finding and executing witches.
At the close of the Middle Ages, Europeans became convinced they were under attack by Satan himself through the recruitment of witches. The church aligned itself with civil authorities, and anti-witchcraft legislation was enacted to combat the problem. Demonologists appeared, clerics who wrote books about how to identify and eradicate witches, sometimes based on religious texts, but often pilfered from confessions and combined with fertile imaginations.
Then, witch finders were sent out into communities to find and execute those guilty of witchcraft. How this movement became a full-fledged panic was down to technological innovation. The printing press had recently been invented, allowing for the printing and dissemination of books. First, in 1484, Pope Innocent VIII published the quote-unquote witch bull, which declared that witchcraft was a problem and that inquisitors should be given full authority to prosecute and execute witches. This gave the church's approval to the movement. Secondly, was the publication of the book Malleus Maleficarum, which was widely disseminated.
If you're a fucking nerd, the witch finders and the Malleus Maleficarum are going to remind you of the book Good Omens.
Yes.
And I'm trying to separate that fun read that is one of my favorite books of all time from the very real horrors that we're about to describe. So if that's where you're living right now, I'm there with you, and I am separating that from my brain. So the Malleus Maleficarum, which translates to the Hammer of Witches in English, is a notorious medieval treatise on witchcraft and witch hunting. It was written by two German Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, and first published in 1487. The book is often considered one of the most influential and authoritative texts on the subject of witchcraft during the late medieval period and the early modern period.
The primary purpose of the Malleus Maleficarum was to provide a comprehensive guide for the identification, prosecution, and extermination of witches. It aimed to provide a theological and legal basis for the witch hunts that were occurring in Europe during the late 15th century. The Malleus Maleficarum contains strong misogynistic views, portraying women as particularly susceptible to witchcraft and evil. It perpetuates harmful stereotypes about women and their supposed inherent moral and intellectual weaknesses.
The Malleus Maleficarum provided detailed advice on how to detect and interrogate witches, emphasizing the importance of identifying and prosecuting those accused of witchcraft. The book suggested that authorities should conduct thorough physical examinations of suspected witches. Wow, I wonder how that's going to turn out for women.
I wonder.
This examination often involves searching for so-called witches' marks or devil's marks, which were believed to be supernatural markings on the witch's body where they made pacts with the devil. These marks were thought to be insensitive to pain. Oh, me.
Do you have a witch's mark? Because I do.
I'm sure I do.
I have a birthmark on my navel, and they call it a stork bite. It is a small patch about the size of a lima bean that is red.
Huh.
So think of like a port wine stain, but very small.
Okay.
And I've always been like, oh, if I had been during the time, witch's mark, like 100%. Like, because it's supposed to be like, oh, look where the stork bit you. Like, that's why it's called a stork's bite.
That's charming. I've got a lot of little moles and birthmarks, but I feel like when it comes to me, you wouldn't look long before you find something that you would prove.
We're talking about witch hunts.
Yeah.
After that popular, the witch hunts of the witch trials of J.K. Rowling, that you have the ISBN number for Harry Potter like tattooed across your back would be considered quite the witch's mark.
I have the Dewey Decimal number and Cutter number, which is important because both Melville Dewey and J.K. Rowling are gigantic pieces of it. So it was,
you only know what you know when you know it.
It's true. I mean, it's fine. Yeah. When it's like going through your boyfriend's phone, like you're gonna find something you don't like if you're looking. So don't do that. If they start looking for witches' marks, it's because they know that I've.
The Malleus Maleficarum strongly advocated the use of torture to extract confessions from suspected witches. It provided detailed instructions on various methods of torture that could be employed, such as the strappado, which is suspension by the wrists, the rack, stretching the body, and other painful techniques. The book argued that witches were cunning and would not confess willingly, so torture was necessary to break their resistance.
Another concept that has been multi-purposed in the prosecution of any population that the majority dislikes.
Yes.
The book described a method known as the swimming test or water ordeal, which I think a lot of people are familiar with from Monty Python. Suspects would be bound and thrown into a body of water, often a river or pond. If the person floated, it was seen as evidence of their guilt because it was believed that witches could not sink due to their supposed supernatural nature. If they sank, it was sometimes considered proof of their innocence, although this did not guarantee their release, sometimes because they did not come back from the bottom of the river or pond, I imagine.
The Malleus Maleficarum encouraged authorities to use leading questions and psychological pressure to obtain confessions from accused witches. It also recommended that suspected witches be encouraged to accuse others, leading to a cycle of accusations and trials. The Malleus Maleficarum also advocated the use of oaths and solemn pledges during interrogations. Suspects were often asked to swear an oath or take a vow in the name of God to tell the truth about their involvement in witchcraft. I've included here a description of what the witch craze was like at its height from the Prince Bishop of Würzburg, Germany.
Quote, "The affair of the witches has started up afresh, and no words can do justice to it. Ah, the woe and misery of it. There are still 400 in the city, high and low, of every rank and sex, nay, even clerics, so strongly accused they may be arrested at any hour. It is true that, of the people of my gracious prince here, some out of all offices and faculties must be executed. Cleric, electoral councillors and doctors, city officials, court assessors. There are law students to be arrested."
The quote goes on. The Prince Bishop has over 40 students who are soon to be pastors. Among them, 13 or 14 are said to be witches. A few days ago, a dean was arrested. 2 others who were accused have fled. The notary of our church consistory, a very learned man, was yesterday arrested and put to the torture. In a word, a third of the city is surely involved. The richest, most attractive, most prominent of the clergy are already executed.
That's terrible. And I don't want to take away from how terrible the witch hunts were, but it's fascinating to look at a time of such horror and brutality and see that the church held its clergy to some account for something at one point under societal pressure.
Mm-hmm.
It goes on. "A week ago, a maid of 19 was executed, of whom everywhere it is said she was the fairest of the whole city and was held by everybody a girl of singular modesty and purity. She will be followed by 7 or 8 other of the best and most attractive persons, and thus many are put to death for renouncing God and being at the witch dances, against whom nobody has ever else spoke a word."
Goes on. To conclude this wretched matter, there are children of 3 and 4 years to the number of 300 who are said to have had intercourse with the devil. I have seen put to death children of 7, promising students of 10, 12, 14, and 15. Of the nobles, but I cannot and must not write more of this misery. There are persons of yet higher rank who you know and would marvel to hear of, nay, would scarcely believe it. Let justice be done. So to translate what he's saying there are like over 300 children of the ages of 3 and 4 that are accused of having sex with Satan.
Wow.
There are students of 7 through like 12, 13, 14 who have been put to death.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's saying at the end in that sentence, there are persons of yet higher rank who you know and would marvel to hear of, nay, would scarcely believe it. Let justice be done. So what he's saying is the people that are approving of this, you would marvel at, you would not believe me when I told you that these persons of noble rank have allowed this to happen.
Okay.
Like, so he's saying like, this is horrible. And you wouldn't believe the good people that are allowing children to be executed.
Those accused of witchcraft were generally marginalized members of society, with women generally being accused 3 times more often than men. Well, at least we get something, don't we?
Yeah.
But it was believed anyone could be guilty of witchcraft. It's estimated anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million people were tortured and executed for witchcraft during the witch craze. That's an order of magnitude difference. What's the situation there?
I think that anytime that you're trying to calculate a number like that in the past is very difficult because
Their reporting wasn't as judicious as it is today.
And so like the author is making, this is from Witchcraft, Lycanthropy, and they're sort of making allowances for, like, some estimates say, like, 100,000. If you're on the other side, it could be up to 1 million people. So it kind of like, there have been a variation of estimates.
Okay. It's the scholarly hedging your bets. Like it could be, research indicates this is not the truth. It's just that research indicates that this is the truth. And I'm not saying it's true. The research does. It's that sort of, which is academically like sound. So thank you for clearing that up.
Witches were thought to possess limitless powers of destruction. They could fly through the air, change themselves into wolves and other animals, pass through locked doors and solid walls, control other people's thoughts and emotions, and bewitch or kill humans and animals with a mere gaze.
They're animorphs? They're animorphs. On top of everything, they're animorphs. Okay.
Yes. Damn. They raised tempests, which is a fancy way of saying storm. They raised tempests, hailstorms, floods, and lightning. They damaged crops and destroyed harvests and caused sterility in animals and impotence in men. They could produce flies, locusts, serpents, frogs, lice worms, fleas, toads, mice, and other such creatures and send them into the harvest. In addition, it was believed witches conjured demons, precipitated demonic possession, renounced God, made pacts with and worshiped the devil, and devoted their own offspring to Satan.
It was also believed witches were cannibals, digging up graves and eating the rotten flesh. More importantly, it was believed that they ate infants, using the infant's blood to rejuvenate themselves, and from their fat made an unguent that allowed them to fly, which just sounds like primitive adrenochrome, and the QAnon cult. That's exactly where my head went.
Like it's always the same. Mm-hmm. It is always the same.
Yeah. It's always eating babies.
Children, eating babies to get their power, like the power of their innocence.
Have you ever met a baby? They're not powerful. Like they can't do it. They can't even like debate you in an argument and win. Like, what do you think babies are so powerful for? They're nothing. They're helpless.
Well, they're purity. They're purity. That it's through purity, through moral purity. One, this idea that moral purity is something that can be like transferred through some kind of.
So here's the rub, though. Why do babies have moral purity, but toddlers are being murdered for having sex with Satan? Like, at what age do you consent to sex with Satan?
Well, they would not execute a child under the age of 7 because 7 was considered the age of reason. It didn't mean you were incorruptible, but it meant until the age of 7. Age of 7, in confirmation in the Catholic Church, is what is called the age of reason, which is believed to be the age at which children can differentiate between right and wrong.
Okay.
And that has scientific backing. Like in child development studies now, it's like we know that that around that age, like around 3 is when you start to separate from your parents and recognize that you are a separate individual from your parents. And that around the age of 7 or 8 is when you're able to differentiate between right and wrong. And around 8 or 9 is when you start to get a sense of personal shame. Okay. And like when kids suddenly want privacy, they don't want you to see them naked anymore. That kind of thing. Like around the ages of 7, 8, 9, is like when kids will be like, I want to take the shower by myself, right? Yeah. It's like because they're starting to have a sense of themselves as an individual separate from their mom, right? So there is like, they were noticing something that has now been backed by science, which is, that up into a certain age, kids really don't understand the difference between right and wrong. It's not something that you're born with.
Right.
So, so that is... And but I think the idea that you can ingest purity comes from the communion and body of Christ, right? It's like you eat the body of Christ, and it's like, in a way, like what you're doing, right, is you're getting some of that moral purity, that essence,
the absolution.
Right? Yeah. So like there is a long kind of history of cannibalism, even if it's metaphorical, as something. And when you go to tribes, like indigenous tribes that participated in cannibalism up until like modern times. I'm thinking it's like in New Guinea, I think, in some different places, there are still some tribes that would engage in that. And it had to do with this idea that by consuming the enemy, you gained some of their power. So it seems like there is some kind of innate human tendency to as uncomfortable as it is, to cannibalism. And this idea that by consuming the flesh of another person, that they can transmit to you their power or their purity.
I mean, as we've progressed in years and societal and cultural development, we still do that, just not literally. I mean, like the conversation we had with Dr. Tallbear and Buffy St. Marie, people are still consuming the people that they defeat in some warfare. It's just not always grinding flesh in their teeth. Sometimes it's adopting who they are. Yeah. The witch hunt targeted women specifically, and witchcraft was most associated with reproductive control. Witches were said to cause sterility, to cause infants to die, to commit infanticide, and the like. Men, it was said, were spared from witchcraft because women were more morally vulnerable to seduction by the devil. This is seen as a response to increased infant mortality brought on by poverty and malnutrition. Many of the women accused of witchcraft were midwives and also, importantly, community organizers, which makes sense.
Isn't that a coincidence?
It's crazy.
The community leaders that are helping support worker rebellions against the ruling class were women. And it just so happens that those are the ones doing witchcraft.
Crazy. Because if we replace the midwives, then we're probably still going to have babies delivered. It's just the life of the mother might not extend.
Well, midwives were also important members of the community because they monitored births. They recorded deaths. They, because they traveled from around the village and everything, they were knowledge keepers. They were knowledge keepers around birth control, and they needed to create a workforce. So we'd need to get rid of the women that are teaching other women how to use birth control, how to use abortifacients.
Right.
Like, we need to get her out.
Yeah. And they're still doing that today.
Sex workers were targeted as well. So were women who committed adultery. Female friendships were also looked on with suspicion. It was an all-out assault on women. The demonologist's text often devolved into all-out misogyny that had nothing to do with witchcraft, implying that women were lovely to look at, but inevitably only cared for the downfall of man. This served to divide... This served to divide the peasant classes along gender lines, which subverted attempts at the protest of capitalist practices that were destroying their way of life.
All right. Once again, we're back in a time where some of the leading moronic voices on YouTube say the same about women. Yep. Low-value women, high-value women. High-value women support you and don't emasculate you, which I don't want to spoil it, but the topic of emasculation is something I'd really love to discuss more thoroughly at some point. But we still see this. It's so easy to decide that women are doing womanhood wrong, and therefore men, these poor creatures susceptible to our wiles, just which is crazy because they're so strong and alpha. So like, how are they falling to such a little girl? I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, it requires a level of cognitive dissonance to believe any of that.
That's the answer to pretty much all of this. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
This new iteration of witchcraft poised it as an organized religion with a conspiratorial aim to destroy the earth. Sorry to say to all modern witches out there, but there is no evidence that things like covens ever actually existed, even in the pagan tradition. They just made that up. Now, that's news to me. I had no idea.
Yeah. Nope. They made it up. They made it up. That's made up. That was made up by witch hunters. Witch hunters made up covens, and they made up the idea of the Sabbath. They made that up. That is straight. They made that up. So to the modern witches trying to reclaim that, don't do that. That never existed. Witchcraft was never... Witchcraft used to exist as like a singular thing that a person did. They engaged in magic, okay? And the belief was that magic was real, but it was not seen as morally like good or bad, right? It was not considered like an organized religion. The witch hunting manuals posited that witchcraft was part of like an organized religion that in a lot of ways mirrored the church. So this idea that you would have covens And then the witches would enjoy a Sabbath where they would go and like worship the devil the way that someone would go to church on Sunday to worship God. That whole framing was made up by witch hunters. Witchcraft, like before, was like something an individual engaged in. It was not part of a group activity.
Okay.
So just to, and I know that for a lot of people that might be a shocking thing to learn, but that it's like, it is what it is.
It was like skincare.
Yeah. So this is why it's important to separate Wicca and witchcraft as we understand them today from what was meant by witchcraft during the witch hunts. Witchcraft, as we understand it, was invented by the church and by demonologists. They invented the concept of a coven, an animal familiar, and Sabbaths where witches communed with the devil. None of this was a requisite to do witchcraft before. They were trying to overlay the Christian religion onto witchcraft.
The term Sabbath, in the context of witchcraft, typically refers to a gathering or assembly of witches, often portrayed in folklore and early modern witch trials as a key element of witchcraft. These gatherings were believed to involve various ritualistic activities, including communing with the devil, performing spells, and engaging in other magical practices. Sabbaths were a central concept in the witchcraft trials and witch hunting literature of the late medieval and early modern periods.
In Christian demonology and witch hunting beliefs, the Sabbath was seen as a meeting where witches would enter into a pact with the devil. It was believed that during the Sabbath, witches would renounce their Christian faith, worship Satan, and engage in blasphemous acts. Sabbaths were often described as taking place in remote and secluded locations, such as forests, mountains, or desolate areas. They were typically held during the night, and it was believed that witches would gather at these secret meetings to avoid detection.
Accounts of Sabbaths varied, but common elements included dancing, feasting, and participating in magical rituals. It was believed that witches would engage in activities such as flying on broomsticks, shape-shifting, and cursing their enemies during these gatherings. The Sabbath was often thought to be presided over by a Sabbath lord or witch's master, who was believed to be a high-ranking demon or the devil himself. This figure would lead the witches in their rituals and ceremonies. Many of the confessions obtained during the witch trials included descriptions of Sabbath attendants, often extracted under duress or through torture. Accusations of participating in Sabbaths were central to the prosecution of alleged witches, leading to their arrest, trial, and often execution.
I mean, I get it. Like a gathering of women, I understand, like, because when women get together, they'd kvetch.
Yeah, when it said cursing their enemies, like, yeah, the fuck they were. Yeah, they were.
Yeah. I was like, those aren't witches. That's just what happens when women gather.
Yeah. Yeah. Stop fucking up so bad and maybe we'll stop.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, like, women would get together and be like, you know what? Like, men ain't shit. And the church was like, whoa.
Men are shit.
Like, how dare they? Like, they're led by the devil. Like that's what that was.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah. They're like, those women get together and they start talking on us and showing each other how to give themselves abortions. And they're talking about how men ain't shit. And like, we got to stop that,
Yeah.
Or like, yeah.
Sounds appalling, frankly.
Yeah. What the concept of Sabbaths really did was Christianize witchcraft. Whereas before magic was something that was practiced, it didn't necessarily have religious origins. This new form of witchcraft explicitly resulted from making a deal with the devil, so to speak, and a promise to worship the devil, which positioned it as an undeniably anti-Christian and blasphemous practice. So, to put this in modern terms, witchcraft was like QAnon. It was a global conspiracy by Satan in which hundreds of thousands of witches were recruited to destroy the world. Crop failures, death, all of it could only be stopped by stopping witchcraft.
According to demonologists of the time, this new religion was called the Devil's Sect and had originated in the Alps in 1404 and then spread quickly across the continent. Modern scholars, of course, have found no evidence that any such organized witchcraft sect ever existed. In fact, the Sabbath was derived from anti-Semitic rhetoric in the 1300s, which was transposed onto accused witches in the 1400s, because everything comes back to the Jews.
Yep. Always. It's always. So the persecution of Jewish people, since the fracture between the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, right? So like since that fracture, Jewish folks have always been looked at and under like suspicion. So it's always come back to that.
The world's punching bag.
So again, from Witches, Lycanthropy, and Drugs, the book. Listen, some of these quotes, I was a bad writer, and it might come from Caliban and the Witch, and it might not. So you're just gonna have to read both books, okay?
Just do it.
I'm sorry.
Cursing
as a
you.
As a scholar, I am sorry, but just fucking roll with it, okay?
Sovereign, right. I hope you know that we will all be talking about you at our next Sabbath, and we will be shaking our fists at clouds, and I'm going to tell my titties to jiggle twice if they're going to hold you accountable for making me read. Are you kidding me? We don't listen to this podcast because we want to learn.
Yeah.
Ew.
Like, this podcast is free. I just like to take this moment to remind everyone this podcast is free. And you're a hardworking researcher. Sometimes it. All right. But I'm not going to go back and reattribute it because this podcast is free. All right. Mm-hmm. You're welcome. You're motherfucking welcome.
And it's worth it. And we do it for you because we love you.
Yes. All right.
Now eat your goddamn broccoli.
So, quote, ethnographic investigation indicates that the concept of witchcraft can fulfill certain sociological functions. First, the concern over witchcraft seems to be related to socioeconomic distress and political disruptions. 2016 election cycle, is that economic anxiety, anyone? Economic anxiety, anyone? Okay. Disaster, cultural dislocation, and other society-wide calamities can, under some circumstances, be accounted for by ascribing them to the malice of witches. This personifies the woes of the community by laying blame on specific individuals or groups, ferreting out and punishing those pretend malefactors and public enemies may temporarily alleviate built-up tension and anxieties. Thus, witchcraft and witch hunting can act as explanation and remedy for situations beyond human control, unquote.
When all you have is a witch fighting hammer, everything looks like a witch nail.
Yeah, exactly.
The book goes on. Second, in small-scale social formation, where there is intimate interaction amongst members of the community, misfortunes that fall outside individual human control are thought of in personal terms, and a man seeks personal reasons why a misfortune has befallen him in those circumstances. In such a case, bewitchment supplies the answer, attributing to witches unavoidable misfortunes like death in the family, beer going sour, or a milk cow going dry, events against which a person is typically powerless, can in some cases allay built-up apprehensions by shifting the blame to flesh and blood culprits against whom countermeasures can be taken. So you can't whip the cow for not providing milk. You can't hang the beer for going sour. You can't kill the person in your family who died again. So what's an easy scapegoat that's going to give you personal closure? Yeah. Killing bitches.
The quote goes on. Finally, because witches, defined as malicious and inhuman creatures, exemplify the epitome of antisocial behavior, the fear of being suspected or accused of witchcraft discourages unfriendly and belligerent attitudes. Hence, in small-scale societies which lack central authority, witchcraft can act as a means of social control. So you can look at that also like gossip. In small-scale communities, gossip acts as a form of behavioral control.
Yeah,
fear of being gossiped about like keeps you kind of in line. So where there isn't like distinct laws set out,
let's reflect on the song "Baby, It's Cold Outside."
Right.
What
will people say? What will people say? Right.
Yeah.
That's her principal argument.
Yeah.
In the song is like, what will people say?
Yeah.
If I stay, right?
Exactly.
And he's giving her a list of excuses that people would accept.
While ideas of magic have been around since the beginning of time, the large-scale persecution of witchcraft required two prerequisites. Action had to be instigated by the authorities, operating under a theory of witchcraft that was vastly different than popular notions of witchcraft, i.e., a satanic religion, and legal avenues to deal with occult crimes. So we needed the authorities to act on it, and we needed legal avenues to actually prosecute and manage these crimes that were invented. Large-scale witch hunts occurred only where the idea of diabolical witchcraft was fostered by those in control of the coercive and legal machinery. So this came from the people who were pulling the strings.
So that papal bull, right, in the 1400s saying, yes, witchcraft is a problem. It's real, and we need to be prosecuting it. That's an example of, the authority instigating or giving like a call to action.
Okay.
So an official authority, the church, had to say witchcraft is like a religion and it's a conspiracy to bring about the destruction of the world, and it's real and it needs to be prosecuted. That is what gave the hammer of witches its force, its authority, and its legitimacy. So if that papal bull had not been put out, it would have been way harder, right? But that papal bull was put out in part because the Catholic Church was being undermined by heretical sects, right? The heretical religion, which we talked about in the previous episode, was a protest religion. And a lot of people were getting into this protest religion. And the Catholic Church was like, we need to assert dominance here because we're going to lose authority. And so they were like, heretics are witches. Witchcraft is real. It's part of a conspiracy to destroy the world, and is the reason why the plague is here, why the crops are failing, and all of the other things. And we need to do something about it. And so when people say like, oh, conspiracy between the ruling class, no, it wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't a conspiracy to kill women. It was a conspiracy to put down the heretical religious movement, right? And the victims would end up being women. But that was absolutely a deliberate choice that they were making to retain power, as we need to put down these heretical sects, which are emboldening people to rebel against our teachings.
And we, once again, translating it to a view of today, we saw this when religious leaders claimed that, and continue to claim, that every natural disaster is because of gay people, is because of gay marriage, is because of, it's all, I mean, it has not died. It still lives on vociferously today.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so real quick, can you just define papal bull? Like,
a papal bull is when the Pope makes a declaration.
Okay.
So like when the papacy. Yeah. So like when the Pope made the declaration that women who had been raped or sexually assaulted were still considered virgins. Okay. Like that was a decree, right? Saying blah, 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 blah. Like stuff like that. Okay. When a papal bull comes out and says gay marriage is okay, right? Okay. Those are like, it's not, I don't know if it's quite the same thing. I don't know if we do bulls anymore.
Spell it. Is it B-U-L-L?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if we still do those. I don't know. I think we just call them decrees now, but like it's same idea.
I just want to make sure that, especially if English isn't someone's first language, that like the difference between what a papal bull is, and so they know that we're not saying palpable. Weird.
Right. Yeah. So basically the Pope coming down on an issue.
Got it.
Right. Which gives it the authority of God himself. Demonology played a significant role in the emergence and perpetration of the European witch hunts and was deeply rooted in Christian theology, particularly in the belief in the devil and his minions. In Christian doctrine, the devil was seen as the ultimate embodiment of evil, and the church regarded witchcraft as a form of heresy. The theological foundation provided a framework for understanding and persecuted witches as agents of the devil.
Central to the witch hunts was the belief that witches made pacts with the devil, renouncing their Christian faith and pledging allegiance to Satan. I mean, I'm wearing one of my Hail Satan shirts. I'm down. I'm down with a clown when it comes to S-Dog Lucy.
Inquisitors and witch hunting authorities were often well-versed in demonology and relied on demonological texts to guide their investigations and prosecutions. These officials used demonology to justify the torture and execution of alleged witches. While the majority of the information contained in these texts were garnered from confessions from accused people who had been tortured and at times drugged, they had no basis in fact, much like the Satanic Panic during the 1980s. So basically, they would persecute witches and they would torture them into making confessions, or they also would drug them. And hence the drug use in the witches' lycanthropy and drugs, right? And so the people would be basically guided in what they would say.
Okay.
Yes, I went to a Sabbath and then I did this and then I did that. And then they would take that confession, right? And then they would entrench that as into a demonology text, like into a witch hunting manual. Is like, here's what they do. And it's like, but you were telling her her what to say.
It's all circular.
Yeah, exactly.
This is from the book. Quote, "The witch hunt was also the first persecution in Europe that made use of multimedia propaganda to generate a mass psychosis among the population. Alerting the public to the dangers posed by the witches, through pamphlets publicizing the most famous trials and details of their atrocious deeds, was one of the first tasks of the printing press." Oh, yuck. They were the ones who systematized the argument, answered the critics, and perfected a legal machine that, by the end of the 16th century, gave a standardized, almost bureaucratic format to the trials, accounting for the similarities of the confession across national boundaries. It reminds me of those clips of different newscasts across the country that when you put them all together, they're saying the exact same buzzwords in the same order, and you can just overlay like 10 different broadcasts saying the same talking points, word for word, verbatim, that they were fed.
One of the key tenets of demonology was the necessity of torture to extract confessions. And this quote is from the Witchcraft, Lycanthropy, and Drug book. Quote, "When prosecuting people accused of witchcraft and sorcery, the authorities were confronted with the problem of producing evidence. Acts of witchcraft took place unseen at night or in faraway places. For this reason, Baudin advised that, quote, one accused of being a witch ought never be fully acquitted and set free unless the calumny of the accuser is clearer than the sun, inasmuch as the proof of such crimes is so obscure and so difficult that not one witch in a million would be accused or punished if the procedure were governed by ordinary rules," unquote, which is when they would introduce torture.
They wouldn't let anyone off without naming accomplices, with each witch accused turning and accusing about 20 other people of being their accomplice. So the number of trials and investigations was exponential. If you've got one person being forced to spout off, it's like a chain letter.
Yeah, exactly.
Back in the day, torture was only to last 30 minutes and not injure life or limb. However, with each new question was a new 30 minutes. And as investigations expanded, so did the number of torture sessions and the level of violence allowed. There were people that were tortured over 20 or 30 times. That is 15 hours of torture.
Yes.
Allowed under the law.
In reading Michel Foucault's book, he was talking about torture, and it was like the first stage of torture is the presentation of the implements. And he said, you know, with children, the first step was often all that was needed. So that means they were taking 7-year-olds into a room and showing them like, you know, racks and pincers and thumb screws and things like that. Mm-hmm.
Threatening a 7-year-old, very bold.
Very bold maneuver. So this next quote details what an actual torture session looked like. If you are squeamish, you can skip ahead.
I would if I were you. If I could, I would.
Yeah, I would.
Grant yourself that favor.
When we're saying torture, like what we're talking about.
Yes.
Okay, so this is from Witchcraft, Lycanthropy, and Drugs. Quote, "Johann Matthaus Mayfarth, doctor of Holy Rite and professor at the University of Erfurt, gave a horrifying firsthand account of the ruthlessness of the tortures in a book entitled Christliche Irrenierung. And so this is the quote of a quote, right? So this is from the book. There are a few men who in this art of torture exceed the spirits of hell. I have seen the limbs forced asunder, the eyes driven out of the head, the feet torn from the legs, the sinew twisted from the joints, the shoulder blades wrung from their place, the deep veins swollen, the superficial veins driven in, the victim hoisted aloft and now dropped, now revolved around, head undermost and feet uppermost. I have seen the executioner flog with the scourge and smite with rods and crush with screws and load down with weights and stick with needles and bind around with cords and burn with brimstone and baste with oil and singe with torches. In short, I bear witness, I can describe, I can deplore how the human body is violated, unquote.
That's interesting because the title of the book, Christliche Erinnerung, I butchered that. It's been a while since I've been to Germany. It means essentially like remembering, like Christ-like memories, like remembering.
Or remembering
Christ.
the church.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That's a lot.
That is crazy.
The torture started from the beginning of the Inquisition. A person would be stripped naked and shaved of any body hair. The women would be raped at this time. Then they would be led to a room underground through corridors without windows where they would be presented with the inquisitors. Then they would be shown the instruments of torture. For many, this was enough to draw a confession. Others would be made a tea concocted of drugs that would cause them to hallucinate and confess freely and name accomplices. From there, things would get worse. There were considered 3 degrees of torture. We'll outline them here and give some examples to underscore the terrorism that was at the root of these interrogations. My first question is what or which drugs were in that tea? Like what was that tea made of?
Known hallucinogens. People have known about weed and mushrooms and sativa. Like people have known about all of that for a very long time. They knew more about it than some of that. I would argue was even lost knowledge. That when people were still in agrarian societies and
wormwood,
and might have been like kind of and ones that aren't necessarily hallucinogenic, opium. Just anything that could kind of incapacitate you. So they could also like feed you opium. So torture was ordered into degrees. So the first degree, this degree involved mild forms of torture designed to intimidate and frighten the accused. It aimed to persuade the individual to confess without causing severe physical harm. Common methods included the strappado, in which the accused's hands were tied behind their back and then they were hoisted off the ground by a rope tied to their wrists. Then the sudden drop and subsequent suspension would cause dislocation or injury to the shoulders. That's considered mild.
Jesus Christ. That's exactly that's mild. Okay.
Yep.
The second degree was more intense and painful than the first. Torture methods in this degree were designed to inflict significant physical suffering. One common method was the rack, where the accused was stretched on a rack with their limbs pulled in opposite directions, causing excruciating pain. Other methods included the thumb screws and the use of fire or heated instruments to burn the flesh. So this is direct into your skin.
That's just the second degree. They'll go farther.
I hate human innovation sometimes.
Yeah. The third degree was the most severe level of torture and often resulted in severe injury or death. Methods in this degree were intended to break the accused's will and force them to confess. The infamous water torture or water cure was one of the methods used. In this technique, water was poured into the accused's mouth and nose, causing a sensation of drowning. It was a particularly cruel and painful form of torture. Waterboarding, anyone? Guantanamo Bay, anyone?
Oof. These tortures were often permanently disabling and disfiguring. From, once again, the book Witchcraft, Lycanthropy, Drugs, and Disease, We have the description of one such torture. Please, please, if you are gentle of heart and soul like me, please do yourself the favor of fast forwarding through the next 30 or so seconds, because I would if I were you, if that's you.
I think this is why the number is a little harder, because maybe not everyone that went through this process was executed, but they may have succumbed to their injuries. And so how do you classify that? So I think that's also where like the discrepancy comes in how many people died during the witch trials. It's like, well, if you count like how many were like executed on record, it might be the smaller number. But if you take into account people that died after going through this torture,
Absolutely. And once again, record keeping really with the way that we can sort of conceptualize history.
Yeah. So here we go. Quote, his nails upon all his fingers were ruined and pulled off with an instrument called, in Scottish, a turkis, which in England we call a pair of pincers, and under every nail there was thrust 2 needles up to the heads. All which torments notwithstanding, the doctor never shrunk any whit, neither would he then confess it the sooner for all the tortures inflicted upon him. Then he was with all convenient speed, by commandment, conveyed again to the torment of the boots, wherein he continued a long time, and did abide so many blows in them, that his legs were crushed and beaten together as small as might be, and the bones and flesh so bruised that the blood and marrow spouted forth in great abundance, whereby they were made unserviceable forever. So the boot is they would put your leg and your foot in like a wooden boot. And then they would take sledgehammers and they would take screws and they would just make it tighter and tighter and tighter. And so what they did is they crushed this man's legs so badly that bone marrow was coming out.
The mechanisms of the persecution confirm that the witch hunt was not a spontaneous process. A witch hunt required much official organization and administration. Before neighbor accused neighbor or entire communities were seized by a panic, a steady indoctrination took place, with the authorities publicly expressing anxiety about the spreading of witches and traveling from village to village in order to teach people how to recognize them, in some cases carrying with them lists with the names of suspected witches and threatening to punish those who had hid them or came to their assistance.
So, and this must have been so terrifying. The amount of fear that must have been coursing through everybody.
There's nobody you can trust. There's literally nobody you can trust. Everybody is incentivized to basically turn on and victimize people. Snitches get stitches and wind up in ditches, but apparently so do witches.
Yeah.
So what are we to do?
Yeah. With such spectacles playing out at exponential speed, it was only a matter of time before there was a massive resistance to the witch hunts. The witch hunts ended in Europe as the ruling class consolidated their power and it was firmly entrenched. They had effectively rid themselves of social activists and turned lower class women into nothing more than a means of reproducing labor. This had allowed them to accumulate the primitive capital needed to convert from a feudal system to a capitalist one that benefited them just as exclusively. So basically, what had happened was the witch hunts ended once the proletariat had been thoroughly subjugated. And then when accusations started coming for like other members of the ruling class, and then suddenly they were like, whoa, this is crazy. Witches aren't real. Like that is suddenly when that discourse started to come into being, is like when the panic like reached up to that level, then it was suddenly put down. But it was also at a point in which the proletariat had been so thoroughly subjugated. Colonizations had been so deeply entrenched that primitive capital had been accumulated through colonization, the slave trade, and by completely privatizing formerly common areas, which forced people away from subsistence farming to wage earners. And once that had been fully entrenched, and then they got rid of all the women and all the community leaders and all the protest religion sects, like once they had executed all those people and struck fear into the proletariat of like anything deviating from the Christian authority, the Catholic authority. And they had gotten everybody to submit to debt bondage and wage slavery.
Mhm.
Then they were like, witches aren't real. This is getting out of hand. And it has nothing to do with the fact that you've accused my daughter, the princess.
You guys are getting really out of pocket here, and I don't know why you're getting so serious about this. Like,
Okay,
it's not that serious.
So I have an ancestor, like my 12th great grandmother, Sarah, and she was accused of witchcraft and put on trial. And what put that trial to an end was that her husband was the pastor and was like, no, this is ridiculous. It was fine when it was someone else, but now this is getting ridiculous, not my wife. And so she was found innocent out of basically protest, right? So
because one man wanted to, so he did.
Because like once it started to reach a certain class of person, it's like, no. This is for the peasants. Like
We didn't mean it like that. Not like that.
Yeah.
No.
So basically what happened is, and that's also when you see the birth of the Enlightenment, right? It's like once the proletariat had been pushed down to like nothing and the middle class had aligned itself with the ruling class, creating the bourgeoisie and the middle class, then the middle class was like, there's this thing called the Enlightenment. We're not doing this anymore. Because once you'd run out of peasants to do it too, what was left?
Yeah.
And so basically it was like a war between the church and the middle class. Because the church is like, let's keep going. We're getting rid of you motherfuckers next. And that's when they were like, no, we've decided that we're enlightened and that like we kind of doubting the church at this point. We want to introduce this idea of science. It's like, so basically the church was totally down to keep going after the bourgeoisie, but they were like, no. And so that's when they started, that's when kind of it coincides with basically the birth of the Enlightenment, which is when you had a middle class of artisans that had gone to school, but did not yet have access to all the amenities that came with being a noble. And they started to be like, I don't like that. So in a way, they started to align themselves with the proletariat a little bit.
Yeah.
Because they were like, wait, I've got all the money. I have more money than this noble, but I don't get the same amenities because I'm not noble. I don't like this system. So then it's like now they're back to being kind of aligned with the proletariat. And so now we're going to end the witch trials, right? Because now we're enlightened and the witch trials are stupid and witches aren't real and like none of that exists and magic isn't real. Like it was a complete 180. But everything had to do with like self-preservation and whatnot. So
once again, just to shine a modern light on it, it's like the trad wives and the conservative women who have pick-me'd themselves into this place of feeling like they're the conservative, correct, and right. And then they're like seeing their male contemporaries shift their misogyny to the women around them. And they're like, wait, what are you talking about? These are just godly women dancing to music. What's so wrong here? What are they doing wrong? This was a tweet I saw today. It was like this viral thing where this dude's talking about low value women, some dude in his mom's basement talking about how low value some women are. And you see these right-wing women who are the definition of trad wife, who are like, wait, but what's wrong with this?
Well, and it's also the Enlightenment came in like, we're helping the peasant. Like before the French Revolution, Abbé Sieyès wrote like, what is the third estate? Which was essentially like, what is the 99%, the Wall Street movement, right? We're like, we care about the peasantry because we're putting it down. And it's like, motherfucker, if you had not aligned yourself with the ruling class when the proletariat was getting workers' rights, if you hadn't participated with the ruling class to like put them down so that because you thought you were going to have access to that, like this wouldn't have existed. So you didn't save. You were the reason. The call's coming from inside the house. This was you, homeboy.
Your delusions have a body count.
Yeah. Anyway.
From Caliban and the Witch, quote, the counterparts of the typical European witch then were not the Renaissance magicians, but the colonized Native Americans and the enslaved Africans who, in the plantations of the New World, shared a destiny similar to that of women in Europe, providing for capital the seemingly limitless supply of labor necessary for accumulation. Essentially, Blackness and womanness, being defined by bestiality, sexuality, and irrationality, rendered the social contract of a wage unnecessary for their labor.
So when we're talking about what is primitive accumulation, that in order for any capitalist system to work, you need a base resource that no one paid for.
Okay.
Right? And then it becomes a big pyramid scheme.
Mm.
So, well, how do you get that accumulation, that something for nothing? You've got to subjugate some folks and completely devalue their labor so that you're not committing a moral crime by not paying for their labor.
Right. Because you pay for the labor of men, and if someone's not a man, or if they're less than that, then
well, why aren't we paying women? Why aren't we paying slaves? And it's like, oh, well, they're savages, honey. They're morally inferior. Like, their work has no value. Like, they need someone to rule and control them, because if they don't, well, they'll just eat each other, honey. The women will eat their own babies. The savages, they'll cannibalize you and eat it. Like, you can't, they need to be controlled because they can't control themselves. They're animals, honey. Like, I mean, that's literally how, it was played out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you only value humans, then all you have to do is make the people you don't like subhuman.
Yeah.
Easy peasy.
Yes. So we tend to think of the Salem witch trials as the only instance of witch hunting in the New World. But if you consider the charges of devil worship and heresy applied to the indigenous populations and the enslaved populations, think voodoo, think any kind of like war dances. Yeah. Okay. So if you consider the charges of devil worship and heresy applied to the indigenous populations and the enslaved populations and the attempts at Christianization and oppression, we see that it is just a slightly repackaged witch hunt, which would be a deliberate campaign by those in power to instill terror, erode collective resistance, silence communities, and turn them against one each other. And this extends into modernity. For example, Sitting Bull and the ghost dances, which is what I talked about in the last episode, where he had prognostication. Remember, prognostication is what they hate. He had prognosticated that the Lakota, like, they would be victorious if they did the ghost dance. And that started spreading across reserves and into tribal communities. And the colonist government was like, if you're caught doing the ghost dances, straight to jail, straight to execution. Because it was a fear. It wasn't a fear of magic.
They were afraid of empowerment and unity.
If these native folks believe that they will be victorious, it will empower them to revolt. So we have to keep them from having that community with each other, from having that belief that they can win, right? And so that is very much the same as the witch trials in terms of we have to get rid of this magic. It's an evil force. It's very much just a repackaging of the same thing. So when we and I didn't do a lot of research on it, but there are areas in Africa and in Southeast Asia where there's still not even indigenous communities, because you look at it in Haiti, where witchcraft is still something that is believed to be real and that is persecuted. So like, they're just on smaller scales and smaller communities, but there's still there's witch hunts going on even today where, and it's generally related to communities that are being subjugated and an attempt to keep them subjugated by making accusations of witchcraft. So it still happens today. It's just not on like the kind of scale that the European witch hunts were. You know, like the scale of that event is crazy to conceptualize today.
That was bureaucratic and involved the highest level of government or the highest levels of government. I'm not sure where. I don't know if the church was higher or the monarchy,
until like the French Revolution, there were three kind of categories. The number one was the church, because God.
Was that the first estate?
And then, like the first estate was like the king and the nobility, but the king was considered chosen by God.
Okay.
Right. That was how royalty had its power, was like God put them in this position. They were chosen by God. That's why it has to be them. Right.
Yeah. So don't go against them because that's against God.
Right.
Fucking blasphemer.
So number one was the king and then nobility. Then number two was the church.
Okay.
And then number three was the peasantry, which did include the middle class, like the bourgeoisie.
Okay.
So, people like artisans and stuff like that had accumulated wealth, a lot of times more wealth than an aristocrat. But because they weren't noble, there were certain offices they couldn't hold, certain positions that they just couldn't get, despite having maybe more money and influence than their equal in the nobility. Okay. So that's how things were ranked. Abbe Sieyès, who was a member of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, but also held a religious office, during the French Revolution, wrote a pamphlet that got spread out everywhere, like, what is the third estate? Where he said, we make up 99% of the population, but we only get 1/3 of the vote. What's that about? Right. And that's what was mirrored in like the 1% movement, like the Wall Street. Was this idea, like, why does 1% of the population have 99% of the wealth? Right. That was like a page out of Abbe Sieyès' book from 200 years previous. So this struggle has been going on for a very long time.
Pervasive and ongoing.
Yeah.
The stark difference from Sitting Bull and the Ghost Dance is that Native folks' connection to the land, the intricate nature of their familial and clan structures, and their belief systems not allowing for concepts of sin and hell, made their oppression through these methods far less effective. Which is something to keep in mind as we find capitalism weakening and collective consciousness about these issues rising.
The settler state has been trying to genocide Native folks for 500 years. And yet they are still here. And part of the reason that those methods that were used against people during the witch trials and things like that is that Native folks have elaborate kinship systems, and their belief systems like are not Christian. Like they're not like these conceptions of heaven and hell and sin and God as like a thing that is like watching over and judging and all of this stuff. Like,
there's no place for that. There's no port to plug that in.
Yes, has allowed for collective resistance, right? Because as much as Native communities have been genocided and colonized and occupied, they have not been fully broken because they couldn't be turned against each other in the same ways, and because their sense of community and collectivist identity is very strong. And that's something that I think that we as settlers need to keep in mind as we're reaching the end of late stage capitalism, that the way out is that community solidarity, and that means of kinship is how we can survive. The Native traditions and community has thrived because colonizers couldn't go in there and break up those family systems. Like
they literally couldn't even understand it enough to.
I mean, like they tried. That's why they had to send kids to residential schools, because they had to indoctrinate them and like try to convert them into very individualistic thinkers. The way that we are as a settler class is like our sense of identity and everything is incredibly individualistic, and that is to our detriment.
Yeah, they literally had to put the fear of God in them to control them.
I know I rushed to the end. There's not a big denouement where the witch trials ended. It was a slow process wherein the middle class started to really solidify itself and create what we now recognize as like the Age of Enlightenment, which was this shift towards science and away from Catholicism and all of that. But there was no like dramatic, and then it was over. It's kind of like, as they kind of just got exponentially out of hand and started to creep up, like the next class up was like, what the fuck? Like, we can't do this. Like, no. Like, you've gone too far.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that is kind of the history of the European witch hunts. And now I hope you're smarter at a cocktail party. Like maybe it can be a little more interesting. Like,
well, and when the next time you hear somebody declaring that some form of pursuit of legislative justice is actually witch hunting, you can know who the actual victims of witch hunting were and how those words might be coming out of certain mouths.
yeah. So next time a guy goes like, it's a witch hunt. No, it's not. You don't get to appropriate like the largest event of femicide in the history of the world and apply it to yourself. Sorry.
Yeah, because you're being held accountable for your own.
Yeah. So the sources for today was Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. It's considered a very like foundational text, but she's a philosopher, not a historian, which is why kind of periodically I try to let people know like, hey, like in this part, I mean, this is like her idea, and it doesn't necessarily withstand historical scrutiny, but there is enough there that it's worth looking at. The next book was Witchcraft, Lycanthropy, Drugs, and Disease by Homayoun Sidki, which is an anthropological exploration of the witch hunts, and it delves a lot more into disease, drugs, like a more comprehensive anthropological understanding of what the witch hunts were about. And then I didn't quote it directly, but if you read Discipline and Punish by Michel Foucault, it's about the history of the penal system and deals a lot in the beginning with the transition from public executions and torture to private prisons and rehabilitation, and how those also map along the lines of capitalism and the Age of Enlightenment, etc. And it's just as sexy as it sounds. It's one of my favorite books.
It sounds amazing.
Yeah. So those are kind of the three sources that were summarized, used, etc. in today's podcast. Yes.
And one new thing, if you're still listening this far along, not making any promises, just shooting from the hip, just a thought. If you have any big questions that you'd love to hear us answer, not in an episode, I'm not asking for people's suggestions or anything like that, but if you have a question that you think resonates with what we're doing, that you'd like to hear us just explore for a few minutes, at some point, if we get enough, we might do a little compilation like,
yes,
your questions answered.
Yes.
Just for funsies. So if anything occurs to you, do send it along to our Patreon or our email, ideally.
Yes. You can reach us at illreputepod@gmail.com. And you can support us at patreon.com/illrepute. Yeah. So that's how you can support us. The sources will be linked in the show notes. Credits. The script was written by myself, Sovereign Sire. Your hosts are me, Sovereign Sire, and Ella Darling. And the show is generously produced by Mr. Joshua Anderson.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Joshy.
And we welcome your compliments, your suggestions, and yes, in fact, your criticism. But if you have criticism to share, making funny, or we're not reading it.
Yeah, I don't have time to deal with that negative energy. So
meet us where we're at.
Yeah.
Match our energy.
Yeah. If you really want to make a difference, just, be funny. All right. We did it.
All right. We did it.
We did it.
Great script. Yes. Great work. Love you.
Love you
and you
too.
Look stunning.
Oh, thank you.
I am recording this in Austin, Texas, on the historical lands of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Lipan Apache nations. And we thank the First Nations of this land for tending to the land and holding strong in the face of continued colonization, occupation, and oppression.
Yes. And I am coming to you from traditional Tongva and Chumash territory in the Los Angeles, Southern California area. And yes, and this is an acknowledgement that we are occupiers and that we need to begin to deconstruct that and disrupt it as we move forward.